Hello and welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and our main topic tonight, Israel's new strategy for Iran. International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi, recently left Israel after meeting with top Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And the visit coming after new reports on Iran's growing uranium stockpiles at 60% enrichment, and just ahead of meetings on whether to censor Iran for its behavior and lies, including cover-up operations and refusals to explain traces of uranium at undeclared sites. But despite Israel's continued insistence and supposed revelations, the international community is still working towards a return to the JCPOA from 2015, leaving Jerusalem to come up with new ways of making its voice heard. Joining to discuss is founder and CEO of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies and member of the Israel Defense and Security Forum, Dr. Martin Sherman, and then Dr. Mordechai Kedar, Middle East expert and researcher at Bar-Ilan University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I want to start actually with Israel revealing evidence that Iran stole IAEA documents in order to learn how to evade investigations in the future and plan a cover-up. So what makes Western officials so sure that diplomacy will still be successful? And Dr. Kedar, I'll start with you.
Look, Israel proved time and again, especially with the archive, which Israel stole, that Iran was cheating for dozens of years already on the IAEA and on every negotiator which sat with Iran ever. So, but the world, thinks that things can be done. You can have business with these people who are compulsive liars. And unfortunately, we reached a point in which they achieved almost everything which they wanted to achieve, while the world is still sleepwalking vis-a-vis what they do.
Aren't these revelations old news, though? Some of these revelations are from the early 2000s, long before the deal was ever reached.
Well, in a certain respect, they are. But you asked why the European negotiators or Western negotiators think that the diplomacy may be of some effect. And the real answer is that there's no real expectation why they should expect us to be successful at all. Iran has proved time and time again that the only language that she really understands is force. And if we look back, the only time they really stopped the nuclear program was in 2003, after the American invasion into Iraq, and where there was a serious Iranian fear that the Americans would continue into Iran. This is the only time that the Iranians really backed down. So I think that anyone who has a modicum of common sense and understanding of the situation must realize that there's going to be no consensual negotiated resolution to the Iranian nuclear problem. There'll only be a coercive one. And the only question that remains is whether that will be coercive and kinetic and coercive and non-kinetic. In other words, will it involve the use of naked military force or not?
More about that, Dr. Sherman. Today, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said that Iran will pay a painful price for its defiances. What exactly can Israel or will Israel do? Is it a signal that, in your opinion, Israel is ready to attack Iran, or is this new strategy, in a sense, targeted assassinations? What sort of thing are we looking at here?
This comes on the back of the recent major IDF exercise, Chariots of Fire, which interestingly enough involved refueling exercises with the Americans, which certainly I find mildly surprising, given that this regime is in power. The Biden regime has been very, very soft on Iran. So I thought that was rather surprising and somewhat encouraging to see signs of a stiffer American approach. When you ask what Israel can do, I don't have a clear picture, an overall picture of Israeli operational capacities, but I think that Israel probably has a lot more destructive capability than people normally assume. And we've seen in the past some indications that Israeli technology has almost reached science fiction, developed almost science fiction dimensions when you saw the assassination of Fakhrizadeh recently,
Right.
well, not recently, but discussed a few months ago. The Iranians seem almost transparent to Israeli technology. And so Israel could probably inflict quite a lot of harm. The open question is, what would the Iranian retaliation be? And
Right.
up until now, the Iranian retaliation efforts have been somewhat feeble and unsuccessful. Although we shouldn't forget that they were involved in a very painful retaliation in Argentina in 1992 when, in response to the assassination of the current leader of Hezbollah, they launched a massive attack on Israeli installations in Argentina and brought about many casualties and deaths.
So I want to go back. So I want to go back now. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Kedar, I want to come back to you now for a moment. It's been argued over and over again that Iran has never really meant to stay to under the tenets of the JCPOA deal. Yet it was the United States and the West that essentially broke their half of the agreement, and that Iran supposedly did keep their end of the bargain. And beyond that, it's been argued essentially that it's an uphill and ultimately losing battle to continue Israel's policy of trying to attack and prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, that ultimately, if they really wanted one, they'll get one eventually, no matter what. So isn't negotiated settlements and negotiated agreements the best way forward?
I think it was over for years already. And unfortunately, Israel concentrated all the time on the military nuclear program of Iran, instead of having different strategy, which I am trying to convince the Israeli political arena to adopt. What is this? Iran has a very, very weak point, which is the Iranian society. There is no Iranian nation, because Iran is a group of many ethnic groups. Today, what we see is the rebellion of the Ahwazis, the Arabs in the Ahwaz area, the Baluchis, the Kurds, the Turkmens, and the Azeris maybe also. And this should have been done many years ago. Israel should have supported these ethnic groups to get rid of Iran, means to dismantle Iran, just like what happened with the Soviet Union or with Yugoslavia. This would have been the right strategy, how to face Iran, because Iran is not only the nuclear program. Iran, with the years, built a whole empire in the Middle East, which today includes Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza. The strategy should have been supporting the non-Persian peoples in Iran in order to push Iran into a civil war, which actually is there for like a month already. And I'm not sure that the world media exposes what happens inside Iran. And this is the right path. And if Israel is part of it, it's very good. Yet I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, this reminds me really of what Prime Minister Bennett has been saying for years, speaking about Iran's tentacle arms throughout the Middle East and his long-time plans for addressing each of those arms. Is he not addressing those arms, Dr. Sherman?
Again,
it's a bit, not quite clear.
The nuclear weapons by itself is not the problem. The nuclear weapons actually are meant to give Iran an insurance policy that nobody will try to challenge the empire which they are building in the Middle East.
Well, so again, that's my point. Bennett has been talking for years about addressing the various tentacle arms of the Iranian regime, each arm being a different point of their, a different prong of their reach throughout the Middle East, including terror and proxy wars and things like that. So hasn't Bennett or Israel, for that matter, been doing anything to address those arms?
Well, I think certainly you can see the effort in Syria, for instance, where there's been an ongoing campaign to roll back the Iranian the Iranian deployment there. It's just a pity that you didn't do the same thing in Gaza. You know, I think Israel has been active. The question is, has it been active enough? And going forward, what strategies are there? You know, I certainly agree with Dr. Kedar that social unrest should have been used far more as a weapon. But you know, I think you have to sort of look at two time ranges: the short range, whereby I think the only way to have deterred Iran from developing it was with biting sanctions and a credible military option, and in the long run, some sort of regime change, whether it's a regime change to a more benign kind of society that there was before, or whether there's going to be a Hobbesian civil war with every ethnic group fighting the other. But you know, I don't think that we can actually put aside the military capabilities and the coercive side for Israel. But I think Israel has done a lot. There have been a lot of obstacles thrown in the way of dealing with Iran. Many of them domestic. If you remember the stiff resistance that Prime Minister Netanyahu encountered when he wanted to go to talk in Washington against the Iranian
in 2015, you mean?
Deal, and the opposition, both of his military heads, both in the Mossad and the IDF, who in many cases were not really behind the inclination of the political echelon to undertake some military action.
All right, well, I mean, you're talking about biting sanctions and how that was with the additional threat of credible military action. And you mentioned how they were effective in bringing Iran, at the very least, to the negotiating table or to suppress some of their actions. But recently we're hearing about the IAEA and the West censoring Iran. Is that adequate? Is that in that same vein? Or is that, you know, for lack of a better analogy, a fart in the wind?
Well, I don't believe that diplomatic sanctions will be very effective against Iran. I think Iran must face credible military action and serious economic pain. I don't think diplomacy is the language that it really understands or is affected by much.
Dr. Kedar?
The only thing which can change the decisions of the Iranian regime is a credible threat. Nothing but no negotiations, no sanctions, no nothing. Only if they feel the knife on their necks, only then they will start doing what the world is demanding. They will cheat the world as long as they can, and as long as the world does not threaten them by a credible threat of total devastation of Iran.
You don't have any concerns that an escalation of such rhetoric would be reciprocated by Iran?
I'm not talking about rhetoric. I'm talking about acts.
So same thing. You have no fear that such an escalation would only be reciprocated by Iran?
They are not suicidal. If they saw the armies and the navies and the air forces of the civilized world around them, threatening them, then in, let's say, in a week, if they don't succumb and if they don't give up on their nuclear weapons or nuclear program, they will be flattened with the earth. Only this is when they would give up on their nuclear program. Anything else does not work with such a regime.
Well, so what about the concerns that such a threat, especially if credible, would actually drive more people maybe who are on the fence, or maybe even people who are against the regime, to the regime's side within Iran.
Not at all. Not at all. The nature of this country is that if the people smell blood, means smell that the regime is under pressure, this is what will send them to the streets in order to get rid of the regime. Only weakness will push the people to the streets in order to demonstrate and maybe to take weapons as they do today, only because they sense that the regime today is weak. And this is how the Middle East works. It's not Europe, it's not America. In the Middle East, when any regime shows weakness, it invites pressures and actions against this regime.
As I said before at the beginning of the talk, what happened in 2003 when Iran discontinued its nuclear program because of the fear of the American forces close by, it shows that the Iranian regime is responsive to military threats.
Well, okay, so again, maybe another argument is that let's say that the Iranian regime, the Ayatollah regime, is taken down, maybe from within, maybe from without. What would be the reassurance or the guarantee that the regime that replaces the Ayatollah regime wouldn't be worse or more hostile towards the West?
I'm not talking about replacing the regime. I'm talking about dismantling the state into 7 or 8.
So that would okay. But such a vacuum just in neighboring Iraq gave rise to ISIS.
Aaron, ISIS was a small problem, especially compared to Iran. ISIS had, what did they have? Did they have rifles? Did they have maybe RPGs? This is the whole thing about ISIS. ISIS was threatening psychologically because they were slaughtering people in front of the camera. The Iranians are more bright in this. They are slaughtering people without the cameras. So this is, the regime should be dealt with in a way which Hitler was dealt with.
Dr. Sherman?
Well, I'm not as great an expert on Islam as Dr. Kedar, but I don't think that we should totally discount the fact that a more benign regime may emerge from the fall of the Ayatollahs. He may be right that the country may implode into some sort of Obesian anarchy with everybody fighting everybody else. I guess the only other model we have of Iranian civil society is what was before the Ayatollah. And there does seem to be some sort of foundation for civil society. I don't see the prospect of anything much worse emerging. Certainly not in terms of threatening the world with ideological zeal and the wish and the drive to expand and push Islam further and further. I certainly think that if any other regime does emerge, it's much more likely to be more benign than the current one, and probably more focused on internal problems, which are myriad, including shortage of basic goods, shortage of water, agricultural crisis, etc., etc. Maybe I'm being a bit over optimistic, and maybe the realistic scenario is some sort of chaos, which everyone is fighting everyone else. But certainly that might be less of an international problem than the current theocracy.
I think that's still an arguable point, though. I mean, we just discussed how Iran. I mean, Dr. Kedar, you yourself called Iran an empire with its long outreach. How would a collapse of the Ayatollah regime reverberate throughout the Arab world, throughout the Middle East? What would that look like, and how would Israel deal with that?
I'm not talking about the collapse of the Ayatollah regime. I'm talking constantly about dismantling Iran into other states. It could be the Persian area, the Baluchi, the Turkmeni.
It's a fairly semantic difference, but either way, the Iran that we know of today, under your circumstances, under this scenario, would cease to exist, and its reach would also likely crumble or at least be severely damaged. So how would that reverberate throughout the rest of the Middle East?
Well, if you ask how Israel would deal with it, I think Israel would deal quite nicely with the defunded Hezbollah and the defunded Hamas. I don't see that the shrinking of the reach and the power and the influence of the Islamist regime in Tehran is going to promote more or graver problems for Israel. But I don't see that as too much of a threat or a menace on the horizon.
Dr. Kedar, follow up?
Look, whoever talks today about Iran as a united state or consolidated states, I think, can speak about Yugoslavia, about Czechoslovakia, or about the Soviet Union. Iran is on its way to be dismantled. Whether sooner or later it will happen. And the sooner it happens, the better it is for the world. Because against the nuclear program, so far the world, including Israel, failed totally. This is why the strategy should be totally different in order to dismantle Iran and to push it into a civil war, just like what happened in Yugoslavia, in order to build new set of countries, of states, on the ruins of Iran. Iran is an artificial state which was created by Britain and Russia 100 years ago, and it's really time has come for the world to get rid of this artificial state, which turned to be the nightmare for the whole world.
All right, I want to thank both of our guests here, Dr. Kedar, Dr. Sherman. Thank you both so much for joining us again. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. And of course, everyone at home, thank you as well for joining us. I'm Aaron Porras, and this was ILTV's Insider. Please tune in next time for more on everything Israel, and let us know in the comments online if there's a topic that you'd like us to cover next. Finally, for more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv and sign up for our streaming platform, ILTV+. Thank you again. Be well, and we'll see you soon.